This website is a documentary of my life as an owned slave. It is not a porn site with pictures that are posed and contrived. This is my real life as I have lived it for over 10 years with my owner. This was the introduction for a now defunct blog written by a woman named Delia who, after sharing the shocking details of her extreme lifestyle, suddenly vanished in 2003. Almost a decade later, the deeply disturbing truth about Delia was revealed, but to this day, there are still many unanswered questions. Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can become a Ko-fi member or a channel member to gain access to uncut videos and other perks, or you can leave me a tip by clicking the thanks under this video. Thanks to anyone who considers this. This video will cover topics that some might find triggering, including murder and not safe for work content that may not have been consensual. Viewer discretion is advised. You can click the link in the description to become a Ko-fi or channel member to watch an uncut version of this video, which features extra details that were unsuitable for this cut. In the late 90s or early 2000s, the exact date isn't clear, Delia created her blog to document her life as a slave. When you first arrived at the site, you'd be met with 3 photos and a disclaimer, briefly summarising the content of the site and asking that you swear to a number of statements, including that you are over the age of consent, that you acknowledge that you are entering a website that contains adult content, and that you will not redistribute, sell, or post any content from the site. Once you clicked "I swear," you'd be in. The first page provided a brief introduction in which Delia described herself as a 36-year-old, 5 foot 8 inches tall woman with 6 tattoos, 14 body piercings, and a brand on her right butt cheek. She had been on the internet since 1994 and started out posting her digital photography, much of which was self-portraiture. Although her work had been hung in gallery shows and had gotten much acclaim, she admitted it had never sold well, because according to her, everyone who saw her work fell in love with it, but they wanted to buy her, not a photographic print. This is what inspired her to create this blog. She also seemed to enjoy putting on a show for people, later describing herself as an exhibitionist. That and slave wages are abysmal, she said, so this was her day job. 340 pages of her site were public, but you'd have to become a paying member to see the really graphic stuff, comprising of 6,966 photos accompanied by the stories. Delia's blog was deleted in 2004, but I found archives of more than enough to paint a pretty clear picture of her life. I dread to think how extreme the content behind the paywall was, because the public pages already feature some pretty graphic photos and descriptions. There are various photos showing her numerous piercings in an intimate area, so to speak, the branding she had mentioned in the introduction, and other marks that her owner had made on her body, as well as photos of them engaging in activity. Her owner was actually her husband. It doesn't seem that he was actually named on the site, but it was later revealed that he was called Travis. You've probably gathered by now that Delia and Travis were into some pretty extreme BDSM stuff. Being a slave itself falls under this category, but I guess being a slave and being into violent activity isn't necessarily mutually inclusive. Obviously, I can't go into the gory details in the YouTube cut, but let's just say that Delia enjoyed being physically hurt by Travis. She was also into being degraded. For example, Travis would call her names and make her feel worthless. At one point, he even shaved her hair off. Here's a quote from a post about this. This was the first time I was shaven completely bald, shortly after we moved into our first house that wasn't rented. You can tell it was a bit of the classic handyman special from the salvaged and shoddy kitchen cabinets. It was a falling down shack in need of great repair, much tearing down and rebuilding was in order. You can hardly ever fix without intentionally breaking something first, and that applies to people as well as houses. Hair is the last, strongest bastion of human vanity, as sales of Rogaine and countless hair care products testify. It is humbling and humiliating to have your hair taken from you. It is a loss mourned like a dead mother. I know, not many women do. There are not many bald women outside of chemotherapy clinics. It is not an accepted fashion statement for a woman to shed their hair. Unlike men who lose it naturally enough, it isn't shocking to see a bald man. It is shocking to see a bald woman, but the shock to casual onlookers pales to shock inside to be suddenly bald. It broke the last clinging resistance in me to my own body, which is not my own. After the pace of body modifications quickened rapidly, changing me to suit, my mostly unseen seemed such a trivial thing to worry about after facing and being forced to cope with public ridicule of my appearance, which is something I must admit I did need to learn how to cope with better after my childhood, where the only social value instilled was fear of social perception and what would the neighbours think. People aware of the context of my life as a slave often perceive my baldness as a symbol of slavery, and while it is definitely indicative of my condition, I would not call it an icon. It was just a lesson learned. Hair is shallow, hair is silly. Hair and appearance should be trivial things, changeable on a whim without fear of social perception, valuing and desiring only what my owner desires to indulge in at the moment, which does change with regular irregularity. He thinks bald is sexy, but as I write this now I have hair on my head. It's growing out long enough to do some hair bondage again, which he thinks is great fun too. I fully expect to be bald again one day though, probably within the year, just as soon as my owner runs out of manic panic colours to dye my short hair. Despite all this, Delia claimed that her life and their relationship was pretty normal. I mean, her idea of normal isn't necessarily the same as yours or mine. She did say she had to ask permission to do anything, even crossing the road or going to the bathroom. But in response to questions related to her family's perception of her situation, she made the following post. Today, the usually peaceful and quiet home is invaded with family, which are making it difficult to get any work done but inspiring thoughts. Family is an often question, and an odd question when you think about it. The questions are always along the lines of, how do you handle being a slave then? Like it wouldn't keep me from kneeling, bowing and yes-siring enough somehow. It's perhaps like the slightly different question that I personally never get asked because I'm not gay. How do your parents deal with your being gay? However it is, there is a common perception that somehow, not sure how, I have to have problems clashing with society because my relationship is not just like everyone else's. It is pretty much just like everyone else's though. The only two differences to make it stand out is the is really kinky, and I'm not ever going to be headed for divorce court. That right there is enough to make it very different, since relationships are generally considered disposable this day and age. The sex is not something that society sees. They may know you're gay, using the gay analogy, but to know that, they still don't know exactly what goes on in your bedroom. Everyone around me knows I don't wear the proverbial pants. I don't make important decisions. I ask permission to do things. This adds up to be I am just a wife, acting pretty normal for a wife, especially to older people. It does not stand out as different at all. It really isn't different in nature, only to degree. The same could be said for sex is still only different in the degree as well. Unfortunately, because of all the fantasy material that has been propagated about BDSM AL, which is typically written by people who only want, not have, first-hand knowledge of how life works with all that kinky stuff, there exists scant context to answer, how do you handle being a slave then? It's the same way as ever. I personally think the ever-popular and pretty much misogynist fantasy of your generic piece of meat is in reaction to not knowing how to make a relationship work. It is frustration, or at least that's what it seems to me. Fantasies are great and all, I will not knock them, but they don't help you find reality, which is something that I want to do. Give practical, pragmatic, working knowledge to people to help them find their own well-working and satisfying relationships. To have, rather than to fantasize about your unquestioning piece of meat, you have to understand people, what motivates them. No one, I repeat no one, wants to be a slave just to be a slave where it would not matter at all who they were a slave to. It matters. No one is ever suddenly a slave. It takes years of time working on a well-oiled relationship, slowly and surely, before one day you realize that if you said so, your mate would stand in front of a bus for you, do anything for you. You being the critical word. Whether someone is submissive to your authority in a relationship has everything to do with you and nothing at all to do with them. Whether someone already enjoys kinky sex is an entirely different and really unrelated question. Is not a topic of casual conversation for me with my family any more than it likely is for you. They know the gist, but don't care for details. It's not something flaunted or something hidden, just like the structure of the relationship. It's not flaunted or hidden either. Both are comfortable and casual aspects of life, which is exactly how people should approach their quest for a slave, by being comfortable and casual rather than asking the strangers they meet, "Are you submissive?" Pre-qualification questions are hardly impressive, especially when they are so misguided. If you have to ask, the question is always inevitably no. That's the wrong question to ask. What I find particularly interesting and surprising about this site is the social commentary and the thought-provoking dives. It's fascinating in itself to gain insight into a lifestyle that many of us are very unfamiliar with, but some of Delia's posts kind of called out your perception of not just BDSM, but aspects of life in general. I don't necessarily agree with everything she said, but I appreciate that it gets you thinking, and I didn't expect it from a site documenting the life of a slave. To be fair, she was accurate in her description when she said her blog isn't just a site. As for this post specifically, Delia makes a fair point about relationships in general, that there tends to be, to some extent, a dominant and a submissive party. It doesn't really work if both are totally dominant or totally submissive. That's not to say these roles aren't at all dynamic. It's often the case that there's a mix of dominance and submission from both people, depending on the situation. For example, maybe one person is more dominant in social situations and the other takes the lead with decision making. Either way, two overly dominant people will clash, and two overly submissive people will probably never end up doing anything or making any decisions. With this in mind, fundamentally, Delia's relationship isn't too dissimilar to most relationships, it's just a lot more extreme, particularly in the bedroom. As she pointed out in another post, most people wouldn't ask their partner for permission to cross the street like she does, but most would ask their partner before booking a trip. They might not call it asking for permission, but basically that is what it is. In another post, Delia points out a couple of things that she views as positives regarding her situation. Quote, "There isn't a lot different in any relationship between any two people. The rules of social dynamics always apply. One person is always more in control than the other person, in charge, if you will. Bad relationships are when both people think they are in charge. I know damn well I am not in charge. That's okay. I know a nice, smart, alpha male sort of guy is in charge." It removes conflict and competition from the relationship. There is only one set of goals, which are accepted on faith, and it is faith. And there isn't any arguing over them, ever. That's one aspect that makes it good. The other aspect that makes it good is it is inescapable. I'm not a wife, I am a slave. I'm a piece of property. Slave is self-perception, of course. There's no legal status to it. It is more powerful as self-perception. It is much like an ethnic or religious identification. No one can decree you aren't what you are in your own mind. I am a slave. I am owned. I am unable to leave. There's an unexpected benefit to this self-perception. You might as well make the best of it, point blank. Given no other options, it is always in your best interest to make what you have the best that it can be. You stay focused on priorities. My priorities are to have a happy life. It's certainly jarring to hear someone refer to themselves as a piece of property and to say their relationship is inescapable, but that they're okay with that. That honestly sounds like my idea of hell, not being able to do what I want and feeling like I'm not free to leave, but maybe that's why I'm single. In a post titled "Sore Winners," Delia explained how she eventually became submissive to Travis. Quote, "My girlfriend is not naturally as submissive as yourself," is a line picked out of context in an email I just got. It makes me think of war. One side in those submits in the end to the other. One side loses. I lost. I went every bit as willingly as Germany or Japan. I gave my so-called gift with the same quiet acquiescence as the southern states in the American Civil War, and brother, what I would have done for a few good cannon. Roll those words across your lips. I lost. There isn't anything natural or easy about losing. It's humbling when one is forced to admit that there is a superior force that cannot be overcome. I'm not talking the little play pretend, ooh, tie me up, bedroom scene either. This is not make-believe. This is painful stuff. The stuff of amnesties, prison camps, and nervous breakdowns. Unfortunately, for a lot of misguided people, it's the stuff of silly romantic notions that have not been put to the tests of reality. It centers in so many minds as a fantasy fixation. I frankly can't believe anyone goes looking for it. I never sought to lose myself, but I did. I'm okay with that now. I've had lots of time to cope with my inferiority to the superior victor. I always fancied myself growing up to hang out with the bull and driving race cars, perpetually single, proverbially wearing the pants. I'd always had that superior role in every social relation prior to my untimely demise. I was about as easy a pushover as a concrete wall. Naturally, I was naturally submissive always because it's the relationship I have now to my owner. The guy with the wrecking ball will that broke me to pieces and put me back the way he thought I should be with such trivial ease. I couldn't do a thing, save kick and scream, and make other futile attempts to resist from time to time along the way. Someone else decided I would be a slave. I tried my best to disagree, but did, much to my surprise, find myself utterly and completely compelled. Those are real social dynamics. They aren't attempts at artificial constructs, which is what you would seem to get if you think there are subs and doms, and you negotiate rules by mutual agreement instead of letting nature take its natural course in the conflict for dominance, in that someone loses, and in losing, submits. Is only as natural as nature, and every bit as cruel. From this post alone, one might wonder just how consensual this situation was in the first place. Delia wasn't a naturally submissive person, but she lost the war against Travis, so had to give in. It kinda sounds like Stockholm Syndrome. As someone who isn't familiar with this type of relationship, it sounds like a bit of a red flag to me, but the rest of her posts seem to imply that she is perfectly content in her relationship. Even in this one, she says she found herself utterly and completely compelled, so perhaps what she's trying to say is that it's not a situation she ever would have expected to be in, but now she is in it, she actually enjoys it. I guess it's not my place to insist that there's something wrong with her relationship if she herself claims there isn't. And while I can't say I personally would want to be in that situation, who am I to judge someone else's relationship, as long as both people involved are consenting and happy? Turns out though, this happy, albeit unusual setup actually wasn't as idyllic as the blog would suggest. One thing that wasn't made clear to readers of the blog at the time is that Delia and Travis had 2 children together who lived with them. Delia had addressed how they deal with their relationship around family, basically saying that because in most ways they're a pretty normal couple, it doesn't ever get brought up, they don't really talk about it. This makes sense when it comes to the in-laws visiting, for example, but how could they totally keep it a secret from their children? I'm not suggesting they were performing inappropriate activities in front of their children, but this slave and owner dynamic clearly went beyond the bedroom, and judging by the frequency of their posts on the blog, they were pretty active in the bedroom. I'm not sure how their children could be totally sheltered from this. Delia spoke about how she wasn't a fan of face piercings because she wanted to look normal in her everyday life, but then to mark their 10-year anniversary, she got a large neck tattoo that was supposed to resemble a collar. That's a lot harder to hide than a piercing that's in an area that wouldn't be on show when you're walking down the street. Regardless, Delia's blog became pretty well known within the BDSM community, and she certainly made no effort to hide her face on there. Surely it was only a matter of time until someone in her town recognized her and word spread. In late 2003, readers of the blog began noticing that Delia seemed a little off, distressed even. As I said already, the blog was deleted a long time ago and not all of it was archived. In fact, I couldn't find any archives of the member-only posts, so I don't really have anything to go off to verify this. But I did find an archived forum post from March 2004 with around 500 comments discussing the blog and the subsequent events. Many of the commenters were members themselves and implied that it seemed that Delia was growing tired of being totally controlled by Travis, which makes sense really. She said herself she was never a naturally submissive person, but that Travis had conquered her. She seemed to find some comfort in this lifestyle for a while, but the type of person that she described herself as before Travis can't find long-term happiness being stuck in a cage, and maybe she was starting to realize this. She'd been ordered to shave her hair more than once, and the first couple of times she accepted it, but eventually expressed her desire to grow her hair out again, and Travis was furious at this and wouldn't allow her to do it. Furthermore, he'd introduced another woman named Ashley into the relationship. At first, he would meet her alone and have contact with her. Delia knew about this and didn't seem too bothered. He even encouraged Delia to have contact with other men too, in front of him, and while she did as she was told, she apparently spoke negatively of many of these men on her blog. After however long of Travis and Ashley speaking and meeting up without Delia, he eventually decided that Delia and Ashley should be intimate together. It sounds like the two women became friends, but it's one thing being in an open relationship where your husband is meeting another woman alone, and another when that woman actually gets introduced into the relationship. This inevitably would have changed things to some extent. On the 1st of December 2003, Delia made a post on the blog explaining that Travis had put a 3-inch by 2-inch padlock on her piercings down there, which obviously was very painful and made walking difficult. This was the last update ever posted on the blog, and after posting regularly on that site and her art blog for years, Delia seemingly vanished, leaving her followers baffled. It wouldn't be long before the shocking truth would be revealed though. Turns out, just hours after her final post, Delia had taken a shotgun that Travis had taught her how to use for self-defense and used it to shoot him 2 times, before calling 911 and confessing to murdering her husband. She was arrested and taken into custody, then let out on bond which had been set at $10,000. Eventually, police decided not to press charges when it was determined that she had acted in self-defense. The Choctaw Plain dealer posted a single, brief article about the case, where it was revealed that Delia's real name was Susan, so I'll be referring to her as Susan from here onwards. Followers and members of the blog were shocked. Although some of them suspected that there was trouble in paradise recently, what could have possibly happened to make Susan want to kill Travis, who she seemed hopelessly devoted to? The questions wouldn't be answered until over 2 years later, when a woman named Noelle was contacted by Susan after she had covered the story on her blog. Noelle had theorized that the relationship between Susan and Travis actually wasn't as consensual as the blog had led people to believe, and even went as far as to suggest that Travis was behind the Delia persona and that he had written all of the posts on the blog. A few months later, in response to Noelle's post, specifically the final line, which read, "I have nothing to back this up, it's just my latest little theory," Susan emailed her, quote, "I have to admit, it is an awkward thing for me to be writing this note, as this is the first time I have attempted a response to anything I've read on the web since December the 2nd, 2003. Now you have something with which to back this up. I rarely check the web for info, as it is frankly depressing. However, finally seeing someone write the truth has made me feel somewhat better. You are correct in coming to these last conclusions you theorize. Foremost, I've kept wondering if anyone would ever notice that Delia's writing was not mine, as so far only the Choctaw County officers in possession of all evidence, including computers, seem to realize this." So this explains a lot. At first it seemed like Susan had fully consented to everything that was happening, but presumably changed her mind, snapped, and shot Travis to escape. It's still not clear to what extent she did consent to being a slave. It's likely that she was into BDSM, but the fact that it was Travis writing the blog, not Susan, implies that at the very least, things were taken further than she was comfortable with. I won't pretend to be particularly knowledgeable on BDSM, especially slave relationships, but from what I understand, some people want the illusion of something without actually having the real thing, if that makes sense. There are very few people that would actually want a 24/7 master-slave relationship, even though many in the community might fantasize about it. The idea of not being able to say no to something is more thrilling than the actual reality of not being able to say no under any circumstances. It doesn't sound like Susan was ever able to say no to anything, including contact when she was ill and literally vomiting. Many people had speculated on the forum I mentioned earlier that Susan had willingly entered into this relationship, but that she didn't realize exactly how difficult it would be until she was in too deep. This is why communication is so important in such relationships. It's impossible to predict how you're going to feel about something like this until you're already experiencing it, and you should be able to revoke your consent at any time, but it doesn't sound like Susan had this choice. In 2013, after seemingly disappearing again since her email exchange with Noelle, Susan finally resurfaced with a new blog, Invisible Survivor. She posted a photo of herself with her collar tattoo visible, alongside her current husband and 2 children, that hadn't been posted anywhere else online, confirming that it was definitely Susan. Here are her first few posts on the blog. I would like to eventually share my thoughts from this experience as best I can to those in the lifestyle, as well as those struggling with healing from depression, traumatic memories, and panic attacks. However, first I wanted to begin correcting here, since I don't know how to get the information corrected on the actual site, in a short manner, inaccurate information that sits at thefullwiki.org/Delia Day. Delia Day was the pseudonym of Susan Anton, an artist, weblogger, and self-described slave who lived in Mississippi with her husband Travis. The pseudonym of Delia Day that I had begun using as an artist in the late 90s was usurped by my husband Travis as the weblogger and self-described slave fronted by images of me. I never did an interview as Delia, nor have I yet been able to read much of My Illustrated Life as a Slave, as it seems to contain many actual physical details from my daily life at the time without the accurate emotions. Since it is still quite painful to reflect on the level of oppression resulting in fear and sadness present during that time period, I cannot but read it slowly. The two also had a son and a daughter from their marriage who were kept shielded from their lifestyle by staying at a boarding school for most of the week, the full wiki. Our youngest son and daughter attended a regular elementary school with regular public school hours and holidays. As well, there were many more reasons than the obvious of why the children were in danger, period. I wanted to take a moment to point out that there are no details that I am writing here that I did not share with law enforcement in December 2003. I chose to waive my right to an attorney during interrogation because I wanted to try to answer any question that I was asked as best I could, without a lawyer trying to prevent me from doing so. For the first time in a long time, I was able to speak without fear. In late 2003, he purchased a shotgun for her to keep in their house for self-defense purposes, the full wiki. Since our house, approximately 1,200 square feet, had over 10 guns already, some of them loaded at all times and within reach of our children, I don't understand why another gun was purchased for self-defense purposes, as to this day I've not wanted or loaded a gun. In addition, we had a 250-pound guard dog that also lived in the house. I'm aware by now that correcting public misinformation is just that, as it is only select details from a relationship that is so thick in complexity that it would take volumes to explain. I did live for several years being told that I was a worthless slave and treated as such under the guise of the lifestyle, but I never wrote in any live journal or did any interviews. There were no safe words for me to use, and Travis left me no choice to leave our hardcore BDSM lifestyle. There was no one I could talk with much, and my mental state continued to deteriorate. I still tried my best to be mum to our children, even as the situation grew more and more grim. I'm aware of those who seem consensually involved in BDSM relationships, and I do not condemn them, but I still cannot agree that children should ever be reared in the midst. In my opinion, children should never grow up believing that love equals pain. Initially, my children and I were treated by psychologists. Although cost prohibited me from receiving more than limited treatment, my children were able to continue for longer. There were only two that we saw who were bubbly and wanted to talk about positives, especially when there was so much available negative. It was really difficult for me to overcome this slave mindset, and all the more that my crime entailed in retaliation. I realised that people, in general, can say what we would never do in any given situation, however we do not honestly know, especially when children are a factor. The brave man who joined this broken family in late 2004 was someone I had known in school, who I hadn't seen or spoken with in almost 20 years. He knew little about us, but gave us much needed stability in the midst of a storm of retaliation from those who continued to be vengeful. As of writing this, my husband and I have been married a bit over 8 years, and the children are the most amazing teenagers I could ever have hoped to see. I'm very thankful for God's repairing of this family through grace. It's so disturbing reading the posts on the blog knowing that they weren't written by Susan, but Travis pretending to be her. The things described in the posts, everything she had to ask permission to do, everything she was forced to do, were concerning enough even when she seemed okay with it, but turns out she really wasn't. It's still not entirely clear how she entered into this relationship. I guess she was open to trying it out at first, but then never given an option to change her mind and leave. She said there were no safe words, and it sounded like it just escalated over time. She was abused for years, and that abuse was documented in detail online for everyone to see. It's absolutely sickening. What's particularly sad is that it seems the impact on her children was what pushed her to take drastic action to leave. If it weren't for the children, I wonder if she would have just continued to endure it. The blog had mentioned that she suffered with mental health problems, including borderline personality disorder and an ED, which unfortunately made her vulnerable and probably easier to manipulate. It's also worth noting that Ashley, the woman that Travis had introduced into the relationship, was only 19 years old, and apparently also suffered with mental health problems. I personally believe Susan, and I don't care whether she consented in the first place or not, it doesn't matter. If there was ever a time that she decided she wanted out, she should have had the freedom to leave. I believe she was abused and eventually snapped, seeing no way out but to murder her husband. That's my opinion, but there are some who believe that the relationship was consensual right to the end, and that she claimed it wasn't so she could get away with murder. For the sake of providing a comprehensive summary of this case, I will play devil's advocate and go into some of the reasons why not everyone is convinced by her story. While the blog was active, Delia also had a separate LiveJournal blog, and so did Travis. Obviously, Susan later claimed that she never blogged online, so according to her, all three of the blogs were run by Travis. But some of the commenters on the forum post I've already mentioned a couple of times felt that it seemed more like there were two people posting on the Delia Day blog. We'll shorten it to the DD blog. People have since compared the writing styles from the DD blog and the Invisible Survivor blog that Susan started in 2013 and pointed out a number of differences. For example, the word 10 always being written numerically in the IS blog and always alphabetically in the DD blog. I found an archive of Travis's LiveJournal and noticed a couple of times he wrote TEN rather than the number 10, so the same as the DD blog. Of course, writing styles can change over time, so I'm not sure this is the most reliable of ways to determine who the DD posts were written by, but some of the posts certainly seem to match Travis more than Susan. Not all of them, though. For example, Travis had a habit of writing many numbers that weren't dates in letters rather than numbers, whereas the DD blog mostly wrote just 10 this way, and many other numbers were written numerically. Some of the members who directly communicated with Travis and Susan regularly pointed out that they seemed to have different schedules. Travis owned his own company, so couldn't have been awake at all hours, and they believed they were communicating with Susan while Travis was asleep. How plausible is it that Travis was able to maintain 3 separate blogs, 2 of which, the DD blog and the DD LiveJournal, were pretty active, while running a business that presumably kept him pretty busy anyway, not to mention his other commitments, his children, and of course creating content for the DD blog? The woman who ran the BME Encyclopedia website at the time was in contact with Travis for years, and eventually Delia contacted her to submit content herself. This woman never had any reason to suspect that her interaction with Delia was actually Travis posing as Susan, and if Travis alone had been in contact with her for years and submitted content of Susan, what would be the point in suddenly pretending to be her? After hearing that Susan had killed Travis, some members went back to read the blog posts, and reading between the lines got the impression that Delia seemed to be growing tired of the relationship, that she was getting sick of not being able to make any decisions for herself, and overall didn't seem that happy. It doesn't really make sense to me that Travis would have written posts in a way that might imply this. I honestly feel that he was too narcissistic to risk anyone wondering if Susan was anything but completely devoted to him. While I do believe that this relationship wasn't totally consensual, at least towards the end, I'm personally not entirely convinced that the DD blog and the DD LiveJournal were written solely by Travis. It makes more sense that they both contributed to it. There were also various inconsistencies across the posts that could be explained by both Susan and Travis posting on the blog. Susan stated that the events detailed in the blog were factually correct, but that the emotions portrayed were not accurate. The emotions weren't always positive though, as some members noted. I wonder if Susan did write a lot of the posts, at least the earlier ones, but she was worried about admitting this later, fearing it would make people doubt her story. I wouldn't even blame her for this, to be honest, considering the tendency to victim blame those who have suffered this type of abuse. Perhaps she thought her story would sound more believable if she just denied any involvement in the blog. There was some speculation on the forum shortly after Travis's death that the couple didn't actually have a 24/7 owner-slave relationship at all, and that the site had been fabricated to some extent for financial gain. According to a couple of the commenters who were paying members, the photos themselves weren't actually that out there without the accompanying stories. These members were obviously part of the BDSM community themselves, so their version of out there might be different to mine or yours. But anyway, here's an excerpt from one comment. There has been so much speculation on whether or not they had to be in the lifestyle to write as they did. Think about it. Did Tolkien have to live in a world of hobbits and elves to write as he did? The more I reflect on what I saw inside the pay area when I signed up for her site, the more I wonder. What would the pictures really have been without the fantastic stories to accompany them? I recall a set of her rolling around in the mud and a story about being a pig, that the mud was full of garbage and waste. Take that away and what do you have? Just a girl in the mud. Something even a vanilla girl would do if it was making her a ton of money. As for the cutting and branding, she was already very much into body mods, so that really wasn't much of a leap for this site. It was the stories that went along with them that really seemed to pull everyone in and make us believe it was true. In the end, I now feel that we were duped. They were masters of marketing. They had almost every fetish covered. Bald women, BDSM, tats, piercings, even saw her pictures on a hair site, and they belong to every forum to go along with it. What better way to bring in customers than to make them feel as if they're your friend? I never got the impression that they were out for anyone but themselves though. All this talk about her lifestyle has left a bad taste in my mouth. Her own site talks down about even using the word lifestyle, and as far as I can tell, she had no contact with the BDSM community, save for AOL and the site. There are quite a few slaves out there who share their lives with us through pictures and words. Some of them ask a price for admission. I've belonged to just about everyone out there. Others give us a glimpse for free. Either way, there are many more realistic portrayals of master-slave relationships out there than what we were given on DD. This is a really interesting possibility. Think about it, in 2024, any blog or even Reddit post that seems even minorly unbelievable is heavily scrutinised. We don't just take people's word for it anymore, they have to back it up with solid proof. And it doesn't sound like there was much solid proof to back up the stories written on the blog. There were plenty of photos showing piercings, tattoos, markings, and the branding, but really, this is all just body modification. The brands and the other marks on Susan's body were patterns. It's not like Travis was just randomly cutting her, and these patterns are basically just a form of scarification. None of the members-only content was archived, so I can't personally comment on it, but from descriptions I've heard, it doesn't sound like the photos showed anything that couldn't have easily been staged. No one saw any part of Susan and Travis's lives that they didn't choose to post online, so how could we possibly know what their relationship was actually like? Delia, whether that was Susan or Travis, made a point of the blog not being public, but fundamentally that's what it was. Actors for adult content will sometimes act in some pretty extreme scenes. It doesn't mean they're actually into that themselves, it's just acting for a paycheck. Who's to say Susan and Travis weren't doing the same thing? As the comment pointed out, they catered to just about every interest that one could have. Of course, it's not unusual for someone to have more than one interest, but what are the chances that they just happen to be into just about everything? And why weren't they involved with others in the community outside their own blogs? They were supposedly into everything. This owner-slave relationship was seemingly a huge part of their lives, and they definitely weren't monogamous. It'd make a lot of sense for them to be involved in the community. The theory that this blog was created for financial gain and wasn't actually representative of the couple's real lives is significant, because if there was no owner-slave relationship, then Susan's self-defense motive is invalid. If, for whatever reason, she wanted to murder Travis, showing the police this blog, whether or not it was factually true, would be a pretty good way to get away with it. Consensual BDSM relationships are pretty taboo and don't have a great track record of being acknowledged, understood, or accepted when a crime has taken place. Look at what happened to Armin Maiwes, who was sentenced to life in prison after killing and eating Bernd Brandes, who had literally volunteered to be killed and eaten. Similarly, Sharon Lopatka consented to her own murder, yet the man who killed her was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. If a serious crime has taken place, it doesn't seem to matter if the act was consensual or not, and in this case, Travis couldn't even argue that it was consensual because he was dead. Outside the BDSM community, a lot of aspects of the activities they engage in are widely misunderstood. People just don't believe that one could enjoy being harmed. So when Susan showed the blog to the police, their instant reaction was probably that there's no way that she would have consented to what was shown in the blog, and to being a slave in general. It is also worth noting that this case never ended up in court, so Susan was never found not guilty. You could assume that must mean that she was telling the truth. On the other hand, it could simply mean that the police didn't think it was worth trying to prosecute her. Furthermore, there is no statute of limitations for murder, but had police decided to take the case to trial and Susan was acquitted, double jeopardy would prevent her from being tried for the murder again, even if they later found evidence to suggest that the murder was not self-defense. Considering Susan was active online even before the DD blog, perhaps police thought it was better to wait and see if she somehow incriminated herself online in the future, rather than take their one chance at that time. Some have even suggested that the case never went to trial because Susan's family was quite prominent, and one member of her family was a judge. I haven't found enough information on this to comment on whether or not it's a plausible suggestion. It seems that there was only ever one article that mentioned this case. There's such little information that some wondered in recent years if Travis's death was just an urban legend. I'm fairly sure this isn't the case, because I did manage to find an obituary for him, but this one brief article, that now exists only on the Wayback Machine, is the only reliable source of information explaining how he died, so it's hard to speculate much on the circumstances of his death. I have read in a couple of discussions that Travis was shot while he was asleep. This wasn't mentioned in the article, so I can't confirm it, but if it is true, Susan didn't act in immediate self-defense. At least there was no altercation in which she feared for her life in that moment and shot Travis to save herself. If she is telling the truth with her story though, it wouldn't exactly be surprising that she eventually snapped after enduring some pretty horrific abuse for years. The only person who is known to have interacted with the couple in person who could potentially shed some light on the situation is Ashley, the woman who Travis introduced into the relationship. She was active on LiveJournal and said she was devastated to hear about his death, but, quote, "Having known he and his wife very well, I'm not angry at her really. I don't want her to be in jail. I want her to be in a quality mental health facility. She needs help and regulated meds more than she needs to be locked up in a jail cell." This is not exactly the type of comment that would be made by someone who believed that Susan acted in self-defense, or that she was in a non-consensual abusive relationship. Ashley seems to be implying that Susan killed Travis because she was mentally ill, not because she had a very good reason to. However, this was long before Susan had spoken publicly about what happened, and we don't know if her and Ashley had any private contact after Travis's death. Ashley was apparently only 19 when she was involved with the couple. It's possible that she was manipulated by Travis herself and maybe didn't have an objective and mature perspective on the situation, so her opinion might well have changed over time. There's even a theory that Travis planned to leave Susan for Ashley, and that's why Susan killed him. If that was his plan, it makes sense that he would have sold Ashley a dream, and so she might not have had an accurate perception of their relationship. It certainly sounds like she was much more involved with him than Susan regardless, so her perception was likely influenced much more by Travis than Susan. Ashley's live journal has been active as recently as 2014, but I wasn't able to find any mention of Susan or Travis since she created the Invisible Survivor blog in 2013, so I have no idea what her opinion of all this is now. As I said, I still personally believe that Susan is mostly telling the truth. I'm not entirely convinced that she never contributed to the DD blog, and I can't even say for sure that the couple were in a relationship as extreme as was portrayed online, but I do think that she was pushed into various things that she didn't consent to, and that's bad enough. Perhaps the content on the site was played up for financial gain, but that doesn't mean that Susan wasn't forced into acting out scenarios that she wasn't comfortable with. They didn't have to be in a 24/7 owner-slave relationship for her to have been abused. I'm not even necessarily saying that Susan isn't being totally truthful about what happened. There's just no way to know for sure, and there are so many questions we'll likely never get answers to. Either way, some of those who followed the DD blog and even had direct contact with Travis have described him as Machiavellian and narcissistic, and from the limited information available, I'd be inclined to agree. From his personal live journal entries, and of course the DD blog, if you believe at least some of the posts were written by him, which seems very likely, he came across as conceited, manipulative, and decently intelligent. All characteristics that would make it easier for him to take advantage of a vulnerable person, and I believe that's exactly what he did. It's not for me to say that he got what he deserved, but I am at least glad that Susan and her children escaped, and I really hope they're doing okay now. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments, plus any other topics you'd like me to cover in the future. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my Ko-fi members and channel members whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time in a new video.